Going live.
Okay, so hi, my name is Sebastian Badin. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you will already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal firstly. The journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institution, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you will also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and then all the volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, of translations, of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China, to India, to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature and in making Marxist theory available that really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting. And also, of course, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it will be, it's essential basically for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Depending on the time zone, good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to another session of Historical Materialism online conference, which has already reached its 4th day, but there's still another week to go. Before I start, as Sebastian Badgen, or more precisely his avatar, just informed you, please support the Historical Materialism project. If you registered for this session through Eventbrite and did not just wait for the YouTube link to be disseminated through the mail list, you can see that there is also a donation option. This conference is for free. There are no registration fees, but there are costs. There are costs for the conference, but there are also costs for the entire HM project. So please, we need your support. We need donations. These 2 years without the London conference has created a problem with the revenue. We need to expand this project for translations, for books, for everything. Apart from that, please take advantage on the offer to subscribe to the journal, which means that for less than 60 euros, if you take advantage of the discount offer, you will get 1,000 pages each year of remarkable Marxist theory, And also, please look for the offers from Haymarket, the 40% discount on the Historical Materialism book series. The Historical Materialism book series, over 330 titles so far, is one of the biggest series of Marxist theory right now in the English-speaking publishing world, comprising both recent new theory, but also documents, but also older titles and classics, and including translations of books hitherto unavailable in English. They appear first in Braille as expensive, relatively academic titles, which you should get your institutions, if you're affiliated to one, to subscribe and get for the library so that students can have access to them. But also, you can buy them yourselves 1 year later when they appear in Haymarket as really, really affordable paperbacks, which, as I already said, are available now at a 40% discount. Now, we have now a really interesting panel. The title is Marxism, Welfare and Care, and we have 3 presenters. We have Kaitlin Peters, who's a PhD student at York University, and we also have Rhiannon Lindgren from the University of Oregon, an employee and PhD student, and Almendra Aladro from the Universidad Nacional Mar del Plata in Argentina, lawyer and also a PhD candidate, and with a fellowship from the National Council of Scientific and Technical Investigation, the CONICET in Argentina. Each presenter will have 20 minutes. I would really ask them to keep to this limit so that we have time for discussion. Our viewers can use the YouTube chat to place questions. They write their questions or comments or anything they want to offer to this discussion, and we will relay them to our presenters afterwards, and they will respond to them. So without further ado, I give the floor to Kaitlin for her presentation entitled The Violent Contradictions of the Canadian Welfare State, Marxist-Feminist Analysis. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, to get started, so COVID had forced Canada's economy into a deep recession, with recovery being slow and uneven, as unemployment rates hit a record 13.7% in 2020, as businesses were forced to shutter their doors to comply with government-mandated lockdowns. The government was forced to act, rolling out the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, otherwise known as CERB, to support workers who had lost their jobs. CERB provided a taxable benefit of $2,000 a month for Canadian residents who were unemployed because of the pandemic. Rather than having to have paid regular contributions into employment insurance, recipients of CERB needed to prove that they had earned at least $5,000 in the last 12 months and had stopped working or working reduced hours because of COVID-19. The Economist had lauded CERB as an example of how Western countries were transforming their welfare states, reversing decades of neoliberal policy to support those who were typically excluded from social supports. Instead of conditionality that ensured benefits only went to the deserving few, this new, more flexible approach would include those workers trapped in less secure work. But for all the state's supposed benevolence during this time, a closer analysis of pandemic federal supports reveals the targeted way in which certain groups were consistently excluded throughout the course of the pandemic, including the long-term unemployed, the homeless, those living with disabilities, the elderly, temporary foreign workers, and undocumented migrants, even though these groups were more at risk of dying from COVID-19, and even as COVID-19 increased the size of the homeless and disabled populations. The exclusion of these groups demonstrates that this is not the return of a more generous welfare state providing universal access to newly socialized public goods. For this to occur, the labor movement and the left would need to be much stronger than they are now to force the state to act for the working class rather than for capital. As it stands, the state acted in service to capital and will continue to do so to support the reproduction of some workers during a crisis to ensure that a sufficient supply of labor power would be readily available while abandoning people who could not easily be funneled into the productive process. Now, social reproduction theorists have long theorized how the conditions of the working class's social reproduction have always been shaped by the power of capital, conditioned on the commodification of labor, society, and nature. Because while reproductive labor, including domestic labor and childcare, is essential to capital because it produces that most valuable of commodities, labor power, capital constantly seeks to externalize its costs. Historically, this has meant that social reproduction is relegated to the private sphere, where it is foisted onto the backs of women who engage in this work as a labor of love, or it is commodified, where it is most often provided by racialized and migrant women who labor for low pay in precarious and even dangerous working conditions. The state has always played an important role in externalizing the cost of reproduction for capital. And this has been especially true for those segments of the population who cannot labor for capital at all, including people living with disabilities, the homeless, and the elderly. These groups are often excluded from welfare state provisioning or forced to live on pitiful supports, relegated to live in poverty because they don't contribute to society, a misnomer for one's inability to labor for capital. And since the mid-1970s and the active implementation of neoliberal policy, the welfare state has been reconfigured to further externalize the cost of reproduction, to reestablish the conditions for profit accumulation. This was achieved by privatizing state assets, often by contracting out public services to for-profit companies, while restricting public access to these services. Paradoxically, as neoliberalism stripped the state of its ability to provide institutional supports, the need for social intervention increased because of the destabilizing impacts of unregulated markets. The result of this austerity increased the burdens of reproductive labor for women, who spend more unpaid hours providing care to compensate for reduced access to welfare services and lower wages. It also pushed many unproductive populations further into poverty, as social aid neglected to keep up with inflation, while supportive programming and staffing were cut. The neoliberalization of the welfare state, specifically the decimation of Canada's employment insurance program, is partially why the country was not well equipped to support workers, as lockdowns and supply chain management issues forced many businesses to lay off workers or decrease their hours. Beginning in the mid-1970s, successive federal governments reduced their financial contributions to employment insurance, finally ceasing all government contributions to the program in 1990, while simultaneously making amendments to the program to make it harder to qualify for. The result was that whereas in the early 1970s, eligibility was nearly universal for employment insurance, it had fallen to 37% by the 1990s. Because of this, many workers would not have qualified for any federal aid because of these previous changes to the welfare state. In this moment, CERB became necessary because if the state were not to have intervened at all, it would have produced a crisis for capital, just as it would the working class. Employers would have faced massive labor shortages, as many workers would have been forced to move, retrain, or drop out of the labor market completely. The state would also have had to contend with a crisis of legitimacy. These potentialities for capital and the state resulted in the federal government temporarily reconfiguring the neoliberal welfare state to support a wider swath of the working class than it normally would, to ensure that capital would not be hindered from extracting the necessary levels of surplus value as the economy recovered, while continuing to exclude the most marginalized because of their reproduction serves no purpose to capital. It should be noted that one of the reasons The Economist and others did believe that CERB heralded the return of a Keynesian-style welfare state was because the program did provide a market improvement from employment insurance, because it included workers who did not make employment insurance contributions, including gig workers. The problem is that by making eligibility contingent on pandemic-related disruption, many people with weak or non-existent labor market attachments were completely excluded from the program, including the long-term unemployed. Notably, people with disabilities and the elderly were also left out of the program. These groups receive social supports that are significantly less than the $2,000 benefit provided through CERB. For example, the maximum monthly amount provided to a single recipient on the Ontario Disability Support Program is $1,169 a month. To give some context, the average cost of rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto is over $1,800. As Disability Rights Group noted, why did the government determine that $2,000 was the minimum amount needed to live on for some Canadians, while disabled people are forced to live on less than $1,200, considering that the costs of living are higher and not lower for people living with disabilities? Similar protests were made by advocates for the elderly, He noted that for those elderly who didn't have a private pension plan through their employer or did not pay into the Canadian pension plan because of a precarious or non-existent work history, the $2,000 would have provided much needed income for those living off of less than $1,500 a month. Yet, even with these initial exclusions, the state was not content to maintain CERB's initial level of generosity. In August 2020, the federal government began to remodel CERB to better discipline labor, splitting the program into 3 separate programs while transitioning some recipients to a modified employment insurance system with a new and lower benefit floor of $1,600. If one wasn't eligible for employment insurance, such as gig workers, you would transition to the Canada Recovery Benefit, CRB, which, unlike CERB, required workers to reapply every 2 weeks and to commit to seeking out reasonable work to continue to qualify. The other 2 new programs, the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit and the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, were 2-week programs that allowed those who were quarantining because of a positive COVID diagnosis or caring for someone who was COVID positive to withdraw from the labor market with modest supports. Amongst these latter 2 programs, Canadians with disabilities continue to be excluded, even those who became disabled because of COVID-19. Take the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, for example, which was designed for those who had to quarantine because of a COVID diagnosis. The 2-week limited nature of the benefit did not properly support those suffering from long COVID, who became known as COVID long haulers, who quickly exhausted the benefit but couldn't return to work. And because COVID long haulers couldn't demonstrate a continued willingness to seek reasonable work, they were automatically excluded from other pandemic support benefits, including the Canada Recovery Benefit. The only option for these workers was to resort to disability support or try and mostly fail to become eligible for workers' compensation if they could prove that they had contracted COVID at work and that their doctor would testify that they were suffering from long COVID, a feat that was mostly impossible to achieve. The treatment of COVID long haulers by the federal government makes painfully clear that this reconfiguration of the welfare state was not intended to protect and support people during a public health crisis. Rather, the purpose of these income supports was to preserve sufficient reserves of labor power for capital. If infection resulted in you no longer being able to reproduce yourself for capital, then you were abandoned, relegated to the meanest mode of existence alongside anyone else who couldn't be easily funneled into the productive process. As the pandemic progressed and vaccination rates increased, the government continued to tighten the screws on labor, acting as if in response to businesses whining that no one seemed to want to work anymore. The federal government announced that it would cut the Canadian response benefit to $1,200 a month in July 2021, while planning to end the full program in September 2021. At the time of this presentation, CERB has officially ended, to be replaced by an even more mediocre benefit known as the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit. So the short-lived and exclusive nature of the federal government's pandemic aid indicates that this is not the return of the welfare state. Rather, the pandemic heralded the temporary reconfiguration of a neoliberal welfare state that for a short period expanded access to a larger group of deserving workers for the benefit of capital. We should apply this lens when considering other long-term changes to welfare provisioning, including the Canadian federal government's establishing of bilateral agreements with the provinces and territories to implement $10 a day childcare across the country. While a national childcare program should be lauded, we also need to recognize that the pandemic-driven recession created incentive for the neoliberal welfare state to intervene on behalf of capital to provide the conditions that would allow large numbers of women to re-enter the labor market after dropping out to care for their children. A national childcare plan is less about gender equity and more about creating female workers whose labor power will help reestablish economic growth trajectories and fill government coffers. As childcare activists have said for decades, a national childcare plan would pay for itself and then some. In contrast, the federal government has neglected to intervene to reform long-term care, despite Canada's nursing homes having the worst record for COVID-19 deaths among wealthy countries. At one point, the Army was brought in to help deal with this crisis, after which they issued a report describing long-term care homes as a shit pit, as residents died from dehydration while feces and vomit covered the floors and walls. Meanwhile, at the municipal level across the country, governments are violently removing homeless people from encampments at a cost of $30,000 per person, even as the number of homeless rise due to pandemic-related job loss. The pandemic is not over, and despite the elderly and the homeless's continued vulnerability to COVID-19, the neoliberal welfare state is not compelled to support these populations on its own volition. So it's not surprising that welfare provisioning excluded the most marginalized during the pandemic. The state is not benevolent on its own terms, since it is typically the manifestation of the irreconcilability of class tensions operating to maintain bourgeois rule. Only the concerted and decisive operation of power on behalf of the working class can manipulate the function of the state to the extent where it serves working people. Take public health care in Canada, for example, which became part of the Canadian welfare state during the Depression and started in Saskatchewan in the 1940s after the people elected the first democratic socialist government in North America, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was a coalition of progressive, socialist, and labor groups. Unfortunately, the labor movement and the left are weak in Canada, resulting in a muted response to the government's exclusionary pandemic aid. Some of the weakness of the labor movement has to do with decades of declining unionization rates in the country, as unionized jobs in manufacturing moved offshore to be replaced by low union jobs in retail and the service sector. Of course, declining unionization can't explain everything. As Sam Gindin notes, Canadian union density is 2.5 times that of the US, yet you would be hard-pressed to say the Canadian labor movement is more interesting and dynamic. Some of the consequences of labor's lack of militancy is that the biggest demonstration of worker power, the strike, has also been in steady decline in the country, and this is held true during the pandemic. So instead of seeing a rise in strike activity, the pandemic seemed to give employers more freedom to appropriate more surplus from workers by suspending key provisions in collective agreements and rejecting the terms of settlement agreements, while provincial governments legislate workers back to work and increasing the common tool used by the state to discipline labor. Instead of direct action, organized labor seems to be taking a more conservative response to the problem of mass social dislocation, favoring online petitioning for the precariously employed or canvassing for the pro-capital, liberal, and NDP parties. As organized labor struggles to protect its own members, those with no attachment to the labor force are mostly forgotten. Disability rights groups and advocates for the elderly and the homeless often act without the support or financial backing of trade unions, who have largely focused on securing paid sick days and extending pandemic income supports for their members. What this means is that until a strong left infrastructure is built, whose base is a militant organized labor movement embedded within the community that acts in concert with a strong political arm, then there is no possibility for the return of the welfare state as we once knew and imagined it to be. Until then, the state will continue to act on behalf of capital, intervening when necessary to establish the conditions needed for production. At times, this may involve supporting the conditions of reproduction for deserving workers, but this generosity will always be held in tension with the relegation of unproductive populations to poverty and death. These violent contradictions reveal how the pandemic welfare state is bound to give with one hand and take with the other to better discipline labor for capital, as long as organized labor remains weak and the working class divided. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kaitlin. And I give the floor now to Rhiannon Lindgren for her presentation entitled Struggles to Survive and Politics of Legitimacy in a Political Economy of Care.
Okay, 1 second. Sorry, my cat has decided to come say hello. Okay, this is the title of my presentation, and let me just set up a timer and I'll get started. In 2020, the so-called crisis of care came to a deadly breaking point with the spread of the novel COVID-19 upper respiratory virus, which at the time of writing has claimed 4.3 million lives globally out of a total of 203 million confirmed cases. In the continuing struggle against COVID-19, the question of care has once again come to the fore of political discussions because the workers of the world found their basic reproductive necessities, such as food, personal protective equipment, hygiene products, and shelter, once again in false scarcity due to capitalism's mismanagement of a crisis. However, this is neither the first nor the final time in which the question of survival and the basic hygienic and material resources needed for the maintenance of human bodies to become a political contestation. The mediation of caring labor under global capital is dubious because, on the one hand, it is determined by capital's continued accumulation, but on the other hand, it is demanded by our immediate bodily needs in order to survive in spite of such a system of exploitation and domination. Reproductive labor is what I consider, and many of the social reproduction theorists that all of us are drawing on in this presentation, to be the condition of possibility for capital's continued accumulation, and consequently, it is often rendered a natural personal service, or my favorite quote, a labor of love, in dominant ideology. Even though we need to care for ourselves and each other as part of a radical political act, merely striving for survival, as we will learn from the struggles of the Black Panther Party, is not sustainable opposition to state violence when capital and its safeguards in the ruling class continue to benefit from what Angela Davis has called the super exploitation of Black labor. In fact, mere survival and subsumption into the American fascist machine is the unsavory end against which Black radicals continue to struggle. Using a feminist historical and materialist analysis, I turn to the past to understand both the limitations and the future possibilities of struggle over survival and reproductive labor, especially given the increased precarity intensified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Ultimately, I find that both the radical political work of the Wages for Housework campaign and the Black Panther Party during the 1960s and 70s demonstrate the necessity of a broader and more complex politics of care, which is grounded not only in life's maintenance and reproduction, but struggling against the conditions of such labor and its uneven distribution, which both historically and currently falls disproportionately to women, femme, and queer people globally, especially Black, Indigenous, and Brown women of color. In the work of George Jackson, the development of political consciousness and the struggles to survive are dialectically sutured to a revolutionary project in politics. In my longer paper, I use both George Jackson and Assata Shakur's writing as a theoretical frame through which to read the Black Panther Party's activities, even though neither Shakur nor Jackson were a part of the formal party leadership. Reading primarily from Jackson's prison writings published in a book called Blood in My Eye, he posits this dialectical movement between survival or meeting on the ground needs and a revolutionary political education. So I'm going to read this quote from the book that I think is really helpful when talking about this sort of movement. He writes, "Consciousness grows in spirals. Growth implies feeding and being fed. We feed consciousness by feeding people, addressing ourselves to their needs, the basic and social needs, working, organizing towards a united national left. After the people have created something that they are willing to defend, a wealth of new ideas and an autonomous subsistence infrastructure, then they are ready to be brought into open conflict with the ruling class and its supports." In this quote, we see that struggling Black populations have bodily, or what we might want to call reproductive, unmet needs. These unmet needs make it difficult to fight state violence when your belly is empty and your housing is insecure or unstable. But it is not just securing the minimum amount of bodily integrity which interests Jackson. It is putting that nourished body to work to build something different or new. So in that sense, this kind of work that the body can do is not wage labor for the capitalist, but instead a different kind of labor, or perhaps a different kind of struggle, which ultimately results in what Jackson hopes to be a completely autonomous infrastructure. In the text, he kind of refers to Lenin's idea of dual power and Huey P. Newton's idea of the Black commune as practical models towards which we can build this autonomous infrastructure. Jackson calls this dialectical movement between meeting on the ground needs and the creation of the autonomous infrastructure, the introduction of the people's government. One of the ways that the Black Panther Party attempted to both meet the unmet needs of Black communities while simultaneously radicalizing and politicizing those needs is through a wealth of community survival programs, which included free dental and health clinics, the Free Breakfast for Children program, and the Oakland Community Learning Center, which was actually one of the longest running programs and closed its doors in 1983. The Oakland Community Learning Center helped community members identify major needs and link all the various community struggles and survival programs together, which allowed the organizing to span intergenerationally. In a taped interview with prominent Oakland Panther Erica Huggins, she recalls that, quote, a number of new programs had developed just by having the school or the learning center there, end quote. And then she goes on to talk about the creation of Seniors Against a Fearful Environment program, as well as the linking of the folks in that program to a welfare referral system, which demonstrated this holistic and intergenerational approach to organizing that happened because of having the center. There was also a free liberation school in the OCLC, and the teachers and students lived together communally, and they were sort of using a very radical liberation-informed pedagogy to teach the students in that community for free. And the reports about how the survival programs were going were featured prominently in every issue of the revitalized Panther newspaper, The Black Panther. But around 1972, the Black Panther Party moved and pushed towards gaining power through electoral politics. Bobby Seale ran for the mayor of Oakland, and Elaine Brown ran for the city council on the Democratic ticket, which they ultimately lost in 1973. Even though Brown and Seale's political campaigns brought what Robin Spencer considers an image of respectability to the Black Panther Party, the electoral campaign also drained their already declining cash flow. Once the majority of money that was made through the party apparatus became largely directed towards electoral campaigns and the security for high-ranking officials, the survival programs lost the emphasis of building face-to-face relationships with the people they were intended to serve. The clinics still offered free medical and dental services, yet there was no recruiting or putting that individual back into the community's larger struggles or plugging them into the Panther infrastructure. Instead, the Panthers continued to build something that they intended to be for the people, but as they grew exponentially and faced more severe political repression from the state and the FBI, they began to leave those very people out of the process of construction of this like autonomous infrastructure that we talked about earlier. The BPP's relationship to the people it attempted to serve is not static throughout the organization's history. And the humble insight that I kind of want to offer as a Marxist scholar of history is that it was not only the highly successful counter-revolutionary campaign of COINTELPRO that separated the Panthers from the people, but that also the focus on political projects of legitimacy like electoral politics threatened to institutionalize and defang a revolutionary force whose original intention was explicitly to jeopardize the stability of the American empire and not secure it. Oops, no, wrong way. Okay. So now turning towards a different terrain of struggle, which politicized the care work disproportionately demanded of women and femmes, let's look at the movement for wages for housework, which began in the 1970s. Frustrated with the misogyny of white Communist Party politics and the lack of liberal feminist attention to women's exploitation, 4 women met in 1972 in Padova, Italy, and created what would become an international campaign to demand wages for housework. The founding documents of this collective powerfully emphasize the centrality of class to the project of women's liberation. The Wages for Housework Collective writes in their initial statements, which I think, I didn't put it in the slides, but their statement for the International Feminist Collective, quote, says, "Class struggle and feminism are for us one and the same thing. Feminism expressing the rebellion of that section of the class without whom the class struggle cannot be generalized, broadened, and deepened," end quote. Accordingly, a class struggle which chooses to forgo agitating around the struggle of women workers, both waged and unwaged, actually undermines itself, since struggle cannot be universalized or expanded without radicalizing and incorporating women's labor, and in particular, women's reproductive labor. Given the politicization that the Wages for Housework campaign had of daily activities like child rearing, cooking, cleaning, sexual activities and practices, and the linkages of those activities with capitalist accumulation and exploitation, the Wages for Housework political framework was perhaps rather unique at the time of their organizing. Even though they were a small group, they faced immense backlash, both from within and outside the feminist movement. Both the white male left and the liberal feminist movement saw the demand for wages for housework as a deterrent to the kind of equality that those groups sought, which I might satirically call equal opportunity employment and exploitation. However, naming wages as the primary goal of the movement was certainly limiting in my view, because instead of creating a process in which women struggle against such working conditions, the narrative of how the public imaginary sort of understood what wages for housework was doing, that narrative became entangled with ideological valuations of time and money. Such capitalist ideology is central to the false narrative that wage labor occurs on a supposedly free market as an exchange between equals. It was unclear to those on the outside of the movement that Wages for Housework sought to abolish the conditions under which such work was performed, as opposed to the ultimately futile task of making women's work valuable under the rubric of capitalism. And so to articulate sort of a framework which helps us understand how a woman in a different positionality might struggle against reproductive labor, I wanted to highlight some of the work that came out of the subcommittee called Black Women for Wages for Housework, which was a separate committee that supported the New York Wages for Housework Committee. Black Women for Wages for Housework was created in 1975 by Margaret Prescott and Willamette Brown to agitate against the immense government budget cuts to crucial social services in New York City that was happening in 1975, but also to sort of have political organizing that was also demonstrating that Black women were supporting this demand for wages for housework. In a 1977 speech, Prescott identifies the figure of the mammy during the time of chattel slavery and the double function of her labor to both secure the reproduction of the master and his white family, while also using the position of proximity to pilfer the master's resources and struggle against the very reproductive work being imposed. Using examples of the mammy taking wages from her master in the form of food, clothing, or books to help educate herself and other slaves, Prescott argues that, quote, "We can see within the housework of the Black woman in the time of slavery, two things were going on: the utilization of that woman to reproduce the master and his family, and at the same time, that woman making a struggle against that work to destroy that work." Oh, wait. I'm not done yet. I'm not done with that slide yet. This quote, I think, articulates most clearly both the ambiguity of reproductive or caring labor, but also the way such labor becomes a site of struggle. I think it's worth noting that perhaps Prescott's direct experience with colonialism and the experience of being a Black migrant lesbian in the US who was hailing from the Caribbean, also impacts her ability to articulate this analysis so clearly because of the specificity of her social position. Now I'm ready to conclude. So to conclude, I am claiming in my paper that survival politics require broader horizons of struggle. Capacious accounts of class, which emphasize the uneven gendered, racial, and sexual divisions of labor internal to the world proletariat, mean understanding reproductive labor as a necessary site of struggle to abolish capitalism. We can and should, in my view, build new forms of relationality, sexuality, and love, which make our reproductive labor oppositional. Without this, we face accepting ideological falsehoods determined by capital regarding the apolitical and non-economic character of our reproduction. This would indicate the necessity of a creation of a politics of care for the oppositional, leftist, and revolutionary struggles currently happening, especially in this neoliberal era, as the previous presenter, Kaitlin, was just discussing, as more and more care work is being privatized and workers within those paid positions are often migrant women of color. When politics around divisions of caring labor and survival are subordinated to more hegemonically masculine tasks of guerrilla warfare and military prowess, the internal divisions which continue to exploit women, femmes, queer, and trans people reproduce the violence of capital and the violence of the state within the laboring classes. It is imperative to refuse those unequal divisions of labor, not just because they're exploitative and unjust, but because without properly addressing them, our struggle cannot be widened, nor will it be a space which can support the myriad of freedom dreams wished upon by the world proletariat. Militancy and care work can and should be two parts of the same overarching process, which seeks to confront capital directly and refuse to do its bidding, which would demonstrate that mere survival can never be our aim. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rhiannon, and I give the floor to Almendra, Aladro, for her presentation entitled Women and Pandemic in a Popular Neighborhood of Mar del Plata. And I also take the opportunity to remind our viewers that they can put questions or comments in the YouTube chat, and I will relay them to our presenters in order to have a discussion and dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm already asking for your forgiveness because my English is not the best you're going to hear during this conference. So I'm going to be really synthetic. Well, this proposal starts from the initial interest of revisiting the concept of right to the city, developed by the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre in the late 1960s from Marxist-Feminist in general, more specifically from the social reproduction theory. Therefore, my work in general and also this text sought and seeks to rejoin the study of exploitation and oppression for the analysis of the contemporary urban phenomenon here in Argentina, in Mar del Plata, in this particular city, returning its political value to everyday life, and that takes place in cities, especially in non-metropolitan cities like Mar del Plata, and proposing an ethnographic strategy that recovers the women's standpoint as defined by Dorothy Smith. Of course, not as essentialist women. During this task, during my doctoral research in a peri-urban neighborhood of the city of Mar del Plata, my doctoral research still ongoing. The interviewees problematized the pandemic situation at different moments in the narratives. Also, the research was not redefined in its objectives to go deeper in the pandemic specifically. It was considered appropriate to in this occasion to make a short parenthesis to research a little more about how these women residents of a popular neighborhood in the city with the highest unemployment rate in Argentina went through social and preventive mandatory isolation and social distance measures. It was two different stages here in Argentina. So the sources that were used to prepare this contribution were in-depth interviews carried out in the doctoral research, select both for the problematization of the pandemic and for the contribution to give context to the neighborhood reality for more clarity, as well as reports of research projects especially funded during the pandemic, and social reports prepared by the technical team of one of the neighborhood institutions. It is called La Casa Encuentro Comunitario. It's a communitary institution that works on territory, a private social institution partially subsidized by the provincial state. So, well, this has not this is not geographical exhaustive. It's just an illustration for you to understand where is Mar del Plata, because it's not an international known city. And on the right side of the image, you can see where is the neighborhood. Is in color in the south of the map. Well, about the theoretical framework, this presentation takes theoretical support in the idea of spaces of reproduction of labor power by Batattario, to try to give a contribution to studies on the right to the city within the Marxist tradition, assuming the commitment to unitarism proposed from the work of Luis Vogel and so on. The regulation of contemporary social reproduction required the recognition of the insufficiency of the nuclear family to individually renew the workforce and generated institutions and its service, schools, hospitals, recreational spaces, pensions, aid systems, social security, and so on. The social space of financial capitalism urbanized and totalizing produces, contains, and regulates the access and enjoyment of these institutions. Cities are also spaces in which a large part of the work of social reproduction can become merchandised, since when it is carried out in a wage-earning way, it produces a large amount of value, which is why it is at the same time reproductive work and productive value in capitalist sense of the term. Capitalist urbanizations does not impose its logic only in the production of goods or in the production of means, but also configures two differential social reproduction process that objectifies two different types of female workers. Then, when they arrive at the capital gates to say the labor power. Capitalism controls the type of labor available also through the inaccessibility of goods and services in the public sphere linked to social reproduction, schools, leisure spaces, healthcare centers, among others, which generates the marginalization of the popular neighborhoods also. Basically, that's the theoretical reconstruction. About the methodological framework. This is a continuity with my doctoral work, with my doctoral research. As I indicated at the beginning of this talk, I developed a qualitative strategy. I try to use really hard an ethnographic approach, specifically the institutional ethnography of Dorothy Smith. For this presentation, I select in-depth interviews that talk about pandemic or give some context to the presentation, and the special research reports and technical reports that I commented before. So I'm going to present some results. First, a bit of context. First, the process of capital accumulation in Argentina, at least the recent one. The capital accumulation process in Argentina is characterized by an active mediation role of the state, where the expansion of social policies and public employment has as its counterpart the attention of debt services and subsides from especially from capitalists that doesn't produce value, produces yes, principally at rural environments. I can't find the word right now. This trend consolidates the recent decades, significantly stresses the predominant and naturalized human rights approach about the social politics in Argentina, because the general impoverishment of the living condition of the working class, the general impoverishment of the population, also the increased unemployment, the underemployment, and the job insecurity, which occur in parallel to the direct and indirect subsidy of the capitalists, are the undermine of this kind of discourses that problematize or puts up the human rights approach. So it's something that it's not a common debate, the question about the capital accumulation. But it's important to have this, or to keep this on mind when we think about what happened previously of the isolation and social distance measures. The second level of context is the municipality of General Pueyrredón, where is the city of Mar del Plata. This municipality is heavily affected by touristification and trend towards socioeconomic polarization compared to the national average, which is derived from the greater consistency of the upper classes, with high presence of people with managerial and professional positions, and a greater vulnerability of the lower classes, where a large number of unskilled self-employees, unemployed and retired people that stands out of any kind of market. Far from being a uniform territory, there are different geographical barriers in its extension of all the neighborhoods, and that, to a greater or lesser extent, stigmatize its inhabitants from a territorial point of view. Discrimination that the pandemic has exposed. In fact, during the first part of the pandemic, a report confirmed the presence of 3 350 community dining rooms that fed around 100 and 110 neighbors per day, each one of them. That talks about the food the feed crisis in the local. And at least the neighborhood, Wolf, is located in the southwest of the city of Mar del Plata, near to Laguna de los Padres, another town around. At 2019, it was inhabited by 1,455 people, distributed in 355 homes. Its urbanization process is characterized by relative proliferation of its population and the reconstruction of precarious settlements on actually occupied lands that share space in turn with large vacant lots and with new construction financed by state-subsidized mortgage loans. This results in a fragmented urban space. One of the municipal government employees told us that during the investigation told us that Nuevo Golf is a complex neighborhood due to its exponential growth. It is wide range of factors and its specific problems as social and economic problems. It has a really bad situation about economical, social, cultural, and environmental problems. Critical situation presents unsatisfactory habitability conditions. I'm sorry. Combined with a high demographic growth rates and low index of environmental sustainability, which significantly impacts on the quality of life and well-being of its residents. Of the total of the economically active population, 65% are employed in changas, in formal self-managed activities of popular economy, or are unemployed. There is a significant prevalence of households that perceive pensions, aids, benefits of the social politics, of which 87% contracted debts when accessing the loans offered by the national state. So mostly there are women with debts with the state. And I see 5 minutes. So some results. All these images are from the neighborhood. Here there are some quotes from the women in the neighborhood, but I'm going to pass to the conclusions so we can chat about it. If the historical moment of the capital accumulation process in Argentina, the role of the state in it, and how the income of the people living in the Nuevo Golf neighborhood is made up together. We can, together with the geographical barriers and unsatisfactory ability conditions analyzed all together, several special practices could be identified when reading the testimonies of the interviewed neighbors. Mobility in this sense enables an explanation in the sense proposed in this work. The immobility raised by the social isolation and social distancing measures, respectively, had a direct impact on the daily life of women in terms of food and health. Poor public infrastructure imposes complex journeys on women in terms of food and health. Poor public infrastructure imposes complex journeys on women in order to do grocery as efficiently as possible on scheduled payment days, payments of the social services, time of the month when at the same time they tend to travel with one or more family members who depend on them, of course. Women in worse socioeconomic conditions incorporate into their routines the maintenance of family vegetable gardens and or the tour of community dining rooms and institutions to be able to feed themselves and their families. And even more complicated situation in experienced by women who suffer or have family members who suffer diseases that require special diets since the price of food is too high. Another issue that has concerned the women interviewed, but which no other type of information has been produced that serves to us another framework for the analysis, is the relating on healthcare for the causes that are not related to COVID-19, such as related to disability, chronic, congenital diseases, and others. In this sense, the lack of proximity infrastructure that provides health services impair the continuity of the treatments of relatives in charge of these women. So, based on this preliminary study, the neighbors of this popular neighborhood are characterized by as triply pauperized workers, the women, of course. Because of women's historical role in the social relations of production, because of the contradictions between the discourse of social rights, the policies effectively carried out, and the quality of these benefits, mainly received and administered by these women, and because of the lack of access to the points of social reproduction that are mainly found in the urban centers, and these neighborhoods are in the periphery. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for three really good presentations. Okay, we haven't got any questions until now. So I will take the opportunity to ask myself a first round of questions to all of you. Well, the first one is to Kaitlin, and my question would be, to what extent do you think that the pandemic not only has shown the limits of the neoliberal welfare state, but it has also been used as a form of further neoliberal restructuring of it? I mean, this is a question that I would like to pose. I would like to pose a question to Rhiannon, which is the following, especially on both parts, but especially the part on the Black Panthers Party, survival pending revolution, which one might say, I mean, Frederick Jameson had said it as an example of dual power, and I concur with this description. And to what extent we can also treat this as an example of how we can move forward with autonomous forms of organizing care provision, and also treat this as a dual power, contemporary form of dual power against, situations like the pandemic, apart from just demanding greater state intervention. And the question to Almendra will be more philosophical. I was just wondering if you could just say a few words more on how the work, particularly the work of Henri Lefebvre, has helped you in this research. And also, since you have some time, if you would like to also to stress, the forms, not only the forms of resistance that emerged during this neighborhood. This, because I think one of the most interesting things, this goes for all of you, is exactly that we're not talking we're also talking not just of negative situations, but also talking about resistances. So this is my point. So, I mean, who wants to go first, Kaitlin?
Sure. No, I think it's true. Like this has been used like in the same sense, Naomi's kind of about shock therapy. A similar thing is happening already with the pandemic in Canada, especially in Ontario, which is where I live. Like we're already seeing, for example, the government just released, the Ontario government just released its latest budget, which maybe somewhat surprisingly, considering how the pandemic impacted education, we're already seeing $500 million in cuts to education. Despite teachers being overworked, despite the necessity of classroom distancing still, these budget cuts are actually going to, result in larger class sizes, less funding for teachers in terms of supplies. And again, this is all being done under the onus of, we're of course in a budget shortfall because of because of income supports in relation to the pandemic. And now this is again being used as an opportunity to result in more restructuring. This is also impacting the healthcare sector at the same time as well. Nurses are incredibly overworked, being forced into forced overtime, and the government has, called for more wage suppression. They're under under I think Bill 124. They have now stipulations that they can't bargain for any wage increase above 1%. And as we know, inflation is definitely not even like inflation in Canada right now is at like 3.6% or 4%. So it's basically asking healthcare workers to take a pay cut. At the same time, we're seeing in the government also building new private highways. So there's new opportunities for cuts and increased privatization, and it's all being done, under the discourse, under the ideology of necessity and budget shortfalls. So it is happening right at the same time. That like neoliberal restructuring is happening at the same time as this very temporarily reconfigured neoliberal welfare state is being scaled back in order to discipline labor. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Rhiannon?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I definitely think as I was doing the research into the Panthers and sort of how they were running their survival programs, I did think it was particularly a strong model to sort of meet these like important bodily needs but also to connect to a larger political analysis. I find that like in my larger paper, I talk about the emergence of mutual aid in the face of the precarity of folks in the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that I found about the way that mutual aid is sort of formulated or framed is that it's highly individualized and it doesn't always connect to a larger political project. So a great thing about mutual aid is you have a bunch of people coming together without the interference of the state to provide for themselves and sort of learn what that means and politicize that act and make caring labor like something as small as delivering groceries, sort of like a moment of political solidarity. But what it failed to do, I think, in my view, what it fails to do is sort of connect that individual act of provisioning and care to like a broader struggle. It's only like seen as quote unquote anti-capitalist, but I'm not even sure like that's such a large category and it doesn't actually like makes particular determinations, which I think the Black Panther Party did. But then once they were focusing more legitimate, like a politics of legitimacy that was seeking to redirect state power towards like Black community control, I think that their emphasis on autonomy really like suffered. So I think there's like a lesson we can learn from there, because there's distinctions, like in the 60s, there was a refusal to participate at all in any way with sort of state electoral politics. And that changed throughout the party's history. So I think it's like important to contextualize sort of what pushed them into that perspective and like the limitations from it. Because I do think COVID presented a time in which care, like basic things such as food and like cleaning supplies, became this like political thing. But I worry that we have to make sure people are moving in the right political direction. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Almendra?
Well, big questions. I like it. Well, let's have that. I think the most I read the work, the most in love I felt with the work, because it helps to think about the framework that that puts the or takes or values. I don't know how to think to put it in words. It helps to revisit the point of view of the peripheries, and here in Argentina, where the process of urbanization in these areas is so unequal. The point of view of the peripheries is so important. And then if I think about the text that mediates the reality as the Smith proposes, and I think about the law as a text and the urban law or the right to the city. We have here a law in the province, not at federal level, but in the province, a law about the access to habitat and the city, and right to the city is a principle of that law, but of course it is less than leftover wants to. So I think it's in its complexity, it habilitates it habilitates like a more complex point of view to the social phenomena about the city, especially to Latin American cities, and that leads me to the second question about the resistance. Of course, this neighborhood has a lot of resistance, little resistance, everyday life resistance. For example, the community dining rooms are thinked and developed by the neighbors, by the women. Of course, they put their money, the food, the time, and the work to prepare the food for the neighbors, and other neighbors go and to the houses and cook with them, for example. And that's in this kind of neighborhoods where the process of creation is the taking of the land, of the occupation, the illegal occupation of the fact occupation of the land, sometimes is problematic, because the one who came first is the one who says who can come to country. So in this kind of crisis, this kind of solidarities are resistance as well, and the women are really the leaders here. I don't think Did I make myself clear about it? Sometimes the translate in my head sometimes is really confused.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, we have another question that has come in. I will read it. It's a little bit technical, but it's really, really interesting. The question is, to what extent does the dominance of a traditional notion of care as a naturalized human relation rather than constituted phenomenologically within capitalist relations of production, where the political economy is not relationally instantiated as opposed to focused on state-private policy and practice, significant in limited critical work? And the question continues, I'm thinking of the work of Feminist Care Ethics by Nell Nordings and Carol Gilligan, however limited, and the gap between political economy and phenomenological politics of care at micro and macro level. So this is the question. The presenters can also read it, they can see it. So no need, but I mean, if I could just make it more general, I mean, it is, I mean, to what extent we need to, what extent different frameworks within which we treat the very notion of care, how do we naturalize it instead of, problematizing it and seeing and historicizing it in the context of both the capitalist relations of production, the role of the state, and the practices and struggles associated with it, whether this kind of taking care as a natural given is a limit to rethinking both the politics of the provision of the care and the struggles around care. So this is, I also give it as a more general question apart from the more technical way it was suggested by the comrade that made this question, which is actually a very good question. So, yep, I suppose this is something that is a question for all of you through your different angles of research. To what extent, what you're thinking about, the very notion of care, of how to frame it. So who wants to go first? Okay, Kaitlin.
All right, I will hazard a try at this. I'm unfortunately not familiar with those particular works, but like in my interpretation of the question, I feel like, and especially based on my dissertation research, which is actually different than my presentation. Like in my dissertation research, I'm studying childcare coalitions between labor and community groups. And so I feel like in relation to how the problematics of kind of like the problems of like naturalized notions of care versus care like based within like a social economy, I sometimes feel like the issues come down to theorizing possibilities for future forms of care in alternative modes of like economic production. And so I think especially like within those naturalized notions of care, you tend to retain very like heteronormative notions of how care should be provided in terms of like who's allowed to provide care and the way in which they provide care, which can often be like kind of bound within feminized notions of what care is and what children need. And so I think it kind of constrains possibilities for the future in terms of how care could be done, maybe even potentially more communally, who's allowed to provide care and like in what context care can be provided. I see this especially amongst like, not that they're necessarily academics, but like even amongst like, for example, people who are activists within the childcare movement, like there tends to be very rigid boundaries about what care can be. And because of those naturalized boundaries around who can provide care, like actually, in fact, some of those more, for them, utopian possibilities still remain firmly rooted within capitalism. It's like, we'll just pay childcare workers more. And then childcare will be more affordable rather than thinking about it beyond like that narrow context. That's my interpretation. Thank you.
Who wants to go? Rhiannon?
Yeah, I can add something there. Yeah, no, I think that this question is really like getting to the heart as well at like one of the major ideological distinctions that like social reproduction theory is sort of trying to investigate, which is like the separation between the economic and the extra economic or the non-economic. And I think, like, to answer your question briefly, I think yes, this distinction between personal relationships of care, what be they like romantic, sexual, or just like in a sort of friendship or camaraderie kind of way, those being sort of naturalized as just like an innate human need, right? Or just the way that humans relate to each other, make them like harder to fit into understanding like particular practices as a type of production and reproduction. And I think like the work of feminist care ethics, particularly in the US, as articulated by Noddings and Gilligan, are important because they're talking about how ethics don't discuss care, but also Gilligan and Noddings aren't thinking about care as a type of labor. And I feel like that's what SRT offers. And Gilligan or Noddings is going to say something like, we just need to value care workers more, very similar to what you just said, Kaitlin, right? Like, we don't need to let the market determine the value of care work. And I think what we're saying in our presentation is like, it already is doing that, right? It's already limiting those forms. But at the same time, those ways of relating and like the relationship I have with my comrades or the people who care for me is how I get enough energy to continue to wake up in this like horrible world built on exploitation and domination, right? So I think like, and that is something that we don't feel as discrete, especially as women or people socialized as women. Like, those two things aren't different categories for us. They're all experienced as in the wholeness of our being in the world, to speak phenomenologically. So I do think there's like an opening there to investigate those connections. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Almendra?
Yes, I don't use the analytic category of care in my work, because here in Latin America, the debate about the care and the care duty and the right of care is really staticized. Like the states take it, and now the state feminism is talking about the care and how the state is going to take care of the care. And I think this have a few problems. The first one is that it is not thought or think about it. It doesn't problematize the question about the infrastructure of care in terms, for example, the Alexandra Kollontai in the Russian Revolution, like collective infrastructure of social reproduction, for social reproduction, like community diners and things like that, or community kindergartens and things like that. Also, that kind of discourses tends to generate insecure jobs for women in territories, like the promotion of rights, of the promotion of good cares and things like that, and working in field is not a good thing at all. And I think that I think that's why I took in the first place in my first lecture, on my first reading. I'm sorry, the translation in my head is like in my first reading of Bhattacharya about the points of social reproduction labor and points of production of value. I think that's the key to stop talking about private policy and public policy, and public sphere and private sphere. I think that's the key, because if we talk about private sphere and public sphere, also we can talk about state jurisdiction, for example. That's the first that's the first way to talk about that at opposites. So I think that that's one of the social reproduction theories keys to start thinking about why we should not talk about care as family care, as household care, as care between people who love each other or people who live together, things like that, and start talking about infrastructure and talk about services. I think that's the, I don't know if I go well, but I think from the right to the city and that that kind of perspective, I think that's what I can say about that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Almendra. We have a question for Rhiannon. It's a question from Maya Welborn, who thanks for the panel. And the question is, how are you conceiving of love as a site of tension or site of evolutionary potential? Is love, in your analysis, a kind of discrete care relation/work than a more general notion of effective commodified labor? And thinking specifically of a text by Cantillon and Lynch, if that is helpful. This is the question. So I would give, so Rhiannon can answer this question, and then also offer any concluding remarks, unless we have some other question. And also Almendra and Kaitlin can also say a few things if they want. Okay, so Rhiannon, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I sort of spoke to this a little bit in what I said earlier, but for me, I think that thinking about love as a type of caring or reproductive labor helps ground it in both a particular, but also more like generalized and universal form. And for me, like the type of love that is demanded between, especially in like the world of compulsory heterosexuality, is a type of relation that is going to produce a subject who is, more easily manipulated and ready to be exploited, either in an unwaged situation or precariously or underwaged situation, as well as on the free market of wage labor. So I think in that way, it's not a pure category, or it doesn't necessarily yield a sort of broader or more left politic, but I think as we sort of unravel or look at those tensions between the reproductivity of our lives and the productivity which helps capital continue to accumulate, and the way that the state intervenes in the like private sphere in order to continue, like as Kaitlin was speaking of, like continue to have that reserve army of labor. I think that it's all connected. And so it's important to sort of recognize that like in a practical way in your daily life, or else you end up doing work that should be oppositional and ends up becoming the continued means for capital's accumulation. So that, and I feel comfortable that that's a nice summary of what I spoke about today. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rhiannon. Kaitlin, any concluding remarks, including your take on the question of love also? I mean, this is a really important question.
I don't know if I have too much to say other than that. I really appreciate anyone who watches the session and the contributions from all of my panel panelists. I learned a lot even while I was speaking. So I really appreciate this opportunity.
Almendra, any concluding remarks?
No, I have nothing to say about the question because I'm a lawyer. She's asking about love, so it's not my field. at all. But I think, already said a few interesting keys to think the subject.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, I think it was a good panel, really, and at the intersection of theoretical research and militant political exigency, which is supposed to be the essence of an HM conference in the general sense. I mean, this is what exactly we aim to, not a traditional academic conference, but something that also deals with real struggles, and I think this everything that we have discussed today is one of the most important aspects of contemporary struggles. As care, welfare and social reproduction are at the center of contemporary struggles, and it's important to maintain a critical perspective and also learn from concrete experiences of resistance and struggle, especially if we want to make sure that still people in struggle can, create structures that can offer care really in ways that at the same time promote struggle. So again, I would like to remind our viewers, first of all, to thank them, also thank the presenters, and I suppose also our viewers would like to thank the presenters. This would have been the moment when in an in-person conference we would applaud them for their contributions and to encourage them to continue their great work, beginning by finishing as soon as possible their PhDs, because it's one thing to start, but PhDs have to finish. Apart from, but I'm sure they're going to end up with great research in the end, because if this part, if what we heard is part of the research, this is more than promising. This is good. And I would also like to remind our viewers that the conference is continuing. We have a full week. The conference ends up on next Sunday evening. So please go to the website, see what you find interesting. You can also watch all the presentations, everything that has been streamed and will be streamed on YouTube. Shortly afterwards, the end of the live streaming is also available to watch and share and communicate. Please consider donating to HM, we need that. And as usual, subscribe to the journal, buy the books, get your institutions to also subscribe to the journal and buy the books of the book series, and in general support the HM project, a project dedicated not just to Marxist theoretical research, but to that kind of Marxist theoretical research that can in the end help real struggles. Again, thanks a lot to the presenters and to our viewers, and have a good afternoon, evening, or night, depending on the time zone you're in.